Welcome to this complete PC building guide. In this video, I'll guide you through all the steps to build a PC and get it running. I'll go as in-depth as possible to make sure you don't have any issues. And, by the way, don't worry if you're using different components than me. Most of the steps here will be the same regardless. First of all, we're going to need a large clutter-free surface to work with. A multi-fit screwdriver. Use one with a magnetic tip, as it will be extremely helpful in case we drop any screws. We also need something to put the screws in to make sure we keep them organized and don't lose them. The manual that came with our motherboard. If you don't have it, you can always search your motherboard model online and get the manual at the manufacturer's website. This one is optional, but I strongly recommend you use an anti-static bracelet. These are usually pretty cheap on Amazon. And some extra things to manage the cables like some zip ties, Velcro tape, and a pair of flush cutters to cut the zip ties. Before we start with the build, we have to take the precautions to not damage our parts with static electricity. While the odds of damaging a component with electrostatic discharge are low, there are a few things we can do to ensure it doesn't happen. Avoid building the computer on a carpet, a blanket, or something similar. Wear cotton clothing instead of wool. Keep all the components in their anti-static bags until you're ready to use them. The best precaution you can take is to ground yourself. One easy way to ground yourself is with the help of your power supply. Take it out of the box, flip the switch to the off position, connect the power cord to the power supply, and then plug it into an outlet. Leave it at the side of the table and touch it before handling the components. This will discharge any static electricity that's built up in our body. If you have an anti-static wrist strap, put it on. Make sure the metal part stays in contact with your skin, otherwise it won't work. Attach the alligator clip to a metal part of the power supply, the grill for example. Now we're connected to the chassis of the power supply and don't need to touch it constantly. You can leave the power supply on the floor and connect the wrist strap to your ankle. This way, the wrist strap will not get in your way while building the computer. Now that we're grounded, we'll begin to build a PC, starting with the motherboard. The motherboard we're using is an MSI Meg X570 Unify. It has an excellent build quality and no RGB, which is a pro for me personally. Take the motherboard out of the box. Remember to grab your manual, the M.2 screws, and the SATA cables for our mechanical hard drives or SSDs. Note that this motherboard comes with a pre-installed I/O shield, but if it's not your case, you will have to take the I/O shield out of the box too. Take the motherboard out of its anti-static bag and place it on top of the box. Try to handle it by the edges, plastic connectors, or backplates. We are going to use the box the motherboard came in as a test bench and static-free surface in case we don't have access to one. For our CPU, we went with the AMD Ryzen 9 3950X. Let's take it out of the package. As with the motherboard, we have to handle it by the edges. Don't leave any fingerprints on top of it. As you can see, at the bottom part, we have a lot of pins that are really easy to bend if we're not careful. By breaking just one of these, our CPU could stop working completely. So be very gentle and cautious during this step. What we have to do now is match this small golden triangle on one of the corners of our CPU with the indented triangle on the corner of our socket. Alternatively, you can check that the text on the CPU is facing the same way as the text on the socket. Pull this lever to the side and up. Now, all those pins we saw earlier have to go inside the holes in the socket. Gently lay the CPU on top of the socket, and it will go in like this without applying any force. Just give it a little wiggle to make sure it's in. Now pull this lever down back to where it was. Note that you'll feel a bit of force when pushing it down. This is normal. And now our CPU is successfully installed. If you're using an Intel CPU, The process is pretty much the same. The main difference is that the pins are in the socket instead of on the CPU. Now we're going to install the RAM. This is a kit of 4 16GB DDR4 3200 MHz Corsair Vengeance sticks. This motherboard supports up to 128GB of RAM, but 64GB is plenty for me. Before installing the RAM, check your motherboard manual to see which RAM slots to populate first in order to get the most performance out of the memory. Usually you'll have a diagram printed on the motherboard itself too. To install the RAM, you'll have to pull down this tab at both sides of the slot. On this motherboard, we have 2 of them. Sometimes you'll have just one tab at the end of the slot. When inserting the RAM stick, make sure you line up this notch with the slot. As you can see, we have a shorter and longer side on our memory, as well as on the slot, so it's pretty easy to line it up. Now just put it in and push firmly down until you hear a click and the tabs go back to their place. Don't forget to peel the plastic off if you have any on your RAM. This is the configuration for 2 sticks on this motherboard. If you have 4 sticks like me, just populate all the slots. You can ensure that they're all in by slightly pushing on the edges. Moving forward, we have our Sabrent 1TB Rocket NVMe M.2 SSD. On this motherboard, we have 3 M.2 slots. We're going to be populating the top one. To do that, we just have to remove this heatsink. The heatsink just slightly improves the thermals of our SSD. Your motherboard may not have any. In that case, just skip this step. To install the M.2 SSD, we're going to need a standoff. These usually come already screwed in the motherboard or in the motherboard box. We'll have to move it to the right position depending on our SSD length. If it's shorter, you'll have to screw it into one of these 2 holes. If it's the same length as mine, just leave it here. And if it's longer, you'll have to remove the standoff. This can be done with your fingers, as it doesn't require a lot of force. With our standoff installed, grab the SSD by the edges and push it into the slot at a 30-degree angle, aligning the little notch on the SSD with the slot. Push it down, and while holding it down, secure it with the M.2 screw that came with the motherboard. Due to the angle that I was recording at, I didn't see that the SSD was not pushed all the way in. I noticed this later on when I test the components. Now remove the protective film from the thermal pad on the heatsink and screw it back on. I'll leave the film on for now, as I'll have to remove the heatsink again later on in order to have access to one of the motherboard mounting holes. To cool our CPU, we went with the Noctua NH-D15. It has an excellent cooling performance and is one of the best air coolers you can get at the moment. Note that every cooler installation method will be different depending on the manufacturer. So if you're using a different cooler than me, or you're installing it on a different socket, check the manual that came with yours and you should be fine. You can also search your cooler model on YouTube to see how to install it on your particular socket. If you use an AIO water cooler, I recommend installing it after placing the motherboard into the case. This way the radiator of your cooler won't get in the way whilst inserting your motherboard. The plastic brackets you see here are for the stock AMD cooler. To install our cooler, we have to remove them. Unscrew them from the backplate, keeping the stock backplate in place. Now we have to use the right plastic spacers for our socket model. We're using an AM4 socket, so we're going to use the gray spacers. First, put the plastic spacers on the screw threads of the backplate. Then we're going to fix the mounting bars using the 4 included long screws. Use the corresponding holes on the mounting bars. For the AM4 socket, use the holes labeled with the number 4. Make sure the mounting bars are curved towards the CPU. Next, we have to apply the thermal paste. Some coolers come with the thermal paste pre-applied. In that case, you don't need to apply anymore. Take the thermal paste included with our Noctua and squeeze a small pea-sized drop in the center of the heat spreader. This may seem little, but once the cooler is installed, it'll spread and cover the entire surface. There are a ton of ways to apply the thermal paste. If you're curious, you can watch this video about how different paste application methods work, and how they impact performance. Each of these methods has very little impact on the performance, so with the standard small drop in the center, you'll be good. To install the heatsink, we have to remove the middle fan in order to reach these screws. Pull the metal tabs out on both sides of the fan, and take it off. Remove the protective cover on the bottom side of the heatsink. Then, put the heatsink on the CPU, aligning the screws with the screw threads on the mounting bars. Now, using the long screwdriver that came with our cooler, screw the heatsink in, applying even pressure on each side. Turn each screw 2 or 3 times, and gently tighten them until they stop. Once the heatsink is installed, we can attach the fans. We're going to use a standard airflow configuration, where the cool air comes in through these fans at the front of our case, and hot air goes out through the fan at the back. So make sure you install the fans blowing towards the back of your case. To know where the fan is blowing, you can check the arrows marked on it. Alternatively, when this sticker is facing you, the direction of the airflow is towards you. Therefore, we have to install the fan with the sticker facing the back I/O panel connectors on our motherboard. To do that, pull these metal tabs on the fan and attach them to the indents on the heatsink. To install the second fan, you need to attach these included metal parts, like this. Then, clip it to the heatsink like you did before with the other fan. We'll have to install it higher than the other fan in order for it not to interfere with the RAM sticks. I like to count these tabs to check that it's attached evenly on both sides. You can use just one fan in the middle if your PC doesn't have the room for a second one, but this will slightly compromise the cooling performance. Now we have to connect the fans to the motherboard's fan headers. You could connect one fan to this CPU fan header, and the second one to the nearest system fan header. What I recommend is to use the supplied split cable to connect both fans to the CPU fan header. To do that, connect both of the fans to the split cable. Then to the CPU fan header. And then we can hide the cables behind this heatsink. There are also a pair of low noise adapter cables included, but I personally don't like them, as they cap the speed of the fans and make organizing the cables more complicated. However, if you decide to use them as well as the split cable, never use a single low noise adapter at the base of the split cable. Instead, connect one low noise adapter to each fan and then connect them both to the split cable. With the CPU cooler now mounted, I recommend testing our components before installing them into the case to confirm they're all working properly. This saves us from having to uninstall from the case a faulty component that needs to be sent back to the manufacturer for replacement. In short, testing the parts can save you time down the road. Let's start with powering the components. If you have a semi-modular or a modular power supply like me, you'll have to locate the cables that we need first. These will come with our power supply unit. Mine came in this box. We'll need the 24-pin ATX power cable to power our motherboard. Two 8-pin CPU power cables for our CPU. and a PCIe cable to power our graphics card. You can see that the layout of the connectors on the power cables matches the connectors on our motherboard, so it's easy to know where they go. Let's plug in the 24-pin cable. Just push it down until this clip snaps in place. Same for our CPU connectors. To install our GPU, move the side with the rear I/O of the motherboard to the edge of the box. Lower this tab on the PCIe slot. Take your graphics card from its box. From its anti-static bag, and remove the protective cover on the connector. Now, gently lower it straight into the PCIe slot. Until the clip snaps back in place, securing the GPU. Make sure the graphics card rests like this on the edge of the box. This graphic card requires one 8-pin connector and one 6-pin connector. As you can see, this cable has two 8-pin connectors that can split into 6+2 pins like this. Connect the power cable to the GPU until the clip snaps in place. Now that everything is ready, detach your anti-static wrist strap from your power supply. Disconnect the power cable and keep the switch in the off position. Now connect all the cables to the power supply. The connectors on the power supply will usually be labeled. Connect the 24-pin cable, the two CPU power cables, and the PCIe cable. Connect a display to your graphics card. Plug a mouse and keyboard into your motherboard. Now connect the power cord and plug it into an outlet. And turn the switch of your power supply to the on position. Next, we have to turn on our motherboard. On this motherboard, we have a power button, but if yours doesn't have one, you'll have to jumpstart your motherboard. Don't worry, this is safe and only requires a screwdriver. To do this, locate the front panel power connector on your motherboard. Consult your motherboard manual to find which of those pins connect to the power switch. As you can see, here are these two pins. To jumpstart the motherboard, all you need to do is gently tap the end of your screwdriver on top of both of these two pins at the same time. You're essentially trying to bridge these two pins together for a split second. Remember, you're only touching the top of just 2 of the 9 pins of the JFP1 header, not all 9. This will turn on your motherboard. Once it's powered on, you should see the lights on your motherboard light up. Your CPU cooler fan should spin, and the GPU fans may spin too. Some GPU fans may not spin until they hit a certain temperature, so don't worry if yours don't. You'll have to mash the delete button on your keyboard to get into BIOS. BIOS is the built-in software of your motherboard. Sometimes you'll need to press another key to enter BIOS. Check your motherboard manual just in case. The first thing we see is that the CPU and the RAM are detected. Although the RAM isn't running at its 3200 MHz, I'll show you how to make it run at its advertised speed later on. Also check the temperature of your CPU. Checking your CPU temperature will confirm that the thermal paste is properly applied and that the CPU cooler installation is correct. Leave the system running for a couple of minutes and see if the CPU temperature stays under 45 degrees Celsius. These are safe temperatures for an idle CPU. If it goes above these temperatures, you should uninstall the cooler, reapply the paste, and do the test again until your CPU is showing normal temperatures. Everything is detected and running fine except the M.2 Sabrent SSD. So I power off the motherboard by pressing the power button again. If you jump started your motherboard, you'll have to power it off the same way with the help of a screwdriver. If it doesn't turn off immediately, hold the screwdriver on the pins for about 8 seconds. Power off our power supply. Put on our anti-static wrist strap again, and inspect the SSD. As we can see, I didn't insert the SSD all the way in. I took it out, installed it properly, and connected all the power cables again. I turned on the power supply and the motherboard. Now our SSD is being detected by our system without any issues. Everything works fine, so we're ready to move on to the next step. Power off your power supply, disconnect all the cables leading to the motherboard, connect the wrist strap to the power unit, and wear it before handling the components again. Disconnect the power cable from the GPU, lower the tab on the PCIe slot, and gently lift your GPU. Put the connector cover back on, and place it on its anti-static bag until we are ready to use it again. Disconnect the two CPU power cables by lifting this clip and pulling the connector out. Disconnect the 24-pin connector from the motherboard. Be careful to not apply excessive force during this step. Now that we've ensured everything works properly, we can start with the case. For the case, we chose the Lian LANCOOL Mesh 2. It has a great cooling performance, it's easy to work with, and the individual covers on the backside of the motherboard are a great feature to hide cables and make everything look cleaner. Before getting the motherboard in, I like to prepare the case by removing all the panels and parts to make it easier to work with. This step is optional, but it makes working with the case easier and lets us have better access to our components while installing them. First, we're going to remove the side panels by opening and pulling them up from the hinges. This case uses magnets to keep the panels in place. Most cases use screws to secure the side panels, so you'll have to remove them first in order to take off the panels. You may be tempted to remove the protective film, but I recommend to leave it on for now so we don't accidentally scratch the panels whilst building the PC. We can also use the box the PC came in to securely store the side panels until we're ready to use them again. Now we'll remove these two back panels by loosening the screws that hold them in place. Next, we'll be removing the front panel. If you grab the front panel from the bottom part, you'll feel a tab. Grab it and pull it towards you until it clips out. This panel is held up by a bunch of plastic clips. Each manufacturer is slightly different, so check there's nothing holding back the panel before pulling it out. In this PC case, we can also remove this fan bracket. To do that, disconnect the fans from the fan hub, loosen the two screws at the top part. and pull out the fan bracket like this. Remember to keep your screws organized as you'll need them again later. Remove this metal part. Remove the two PSU shroud covers. And lastly, remove the magnetic dust filter. To finish preparing the case, we'll have to check that the standoffs are in the right position depending on our motherboard form factor and how many mounting holes it has. The easiest way to do this is to check the mounting holes on your motherboard and match the standoffs on the case. It's important that we only have the necessary standoffs installed, as if we have any extra ones, we could scratch or damage our motherboard from beneath. Motherboards can come in different form factors. Our motherboard is an ATX, but in this PC case, we could also fit a micro ATX, an ITX, or even a bigger eATX motherboard. As you can see, this case has a diagram that shows the standoff configuration for the different form factors. It comes with the standoffs pre-installed for the ATX motherboards by default. This is the micro ATX configuration, the ITX configuration, and the eATX configuration. In order to fit an eATX motherboard in this case, we'll have to flip this cable management bar. Note that normally your case will come with this tool to easily screw or unscrew the standoffs. This tool, along with the screws you're going to need, will come in a box that is usually located in one of the hard drive trays of your PC case. Once our case is ready, we can get the motherboard inside. I strongly recommend to put the case in a horizontal position. This way, it's easier to install the motherboard without damaging it. As you'll remember, we had a mounting hole under the heatsink of our SSD, so we'll need to remove the heatsink before we put the motherboard in. First, we have to install the I/O shield. To do that, check that it is facing the same way as the ports on our motherboard. And push it firmly into the cutout at the back of your case, applying force to the edges until you hear a click and the I/O shield is in place. Then, line up the ports of your motherboard with the cutouts on the I/O shield when inserting the motherboard into the case. If your motherboard comes with a pre-installed I/O shield like mine, you can skip this step. Make sure there are no cables in the way and grab the motherboard by the edges. You can lift the motherboard by grabbing the CPU cooler as well, if it's one with a decent mounting mechanism like this Noctua. Lower the motherboard at a 20-degree angle. Aligning the I/O shield with a cutout at the back of our case. Now, let the motherboard rest on top of the standoffs. Some cases have a standoff with a little knob like this one in the middle to help you align the motherboard and hold it in place. As you can see, I had some trouble aligning the holes on my first try. This is a strange problem to face, but I decided to include it in the video anyway in case anyone encounters it too. Turns out that these tabs on the pre-installed I/O shield were creating a small gap here, preventing the motherboard from going all the way in. I solved this by removing the I/O shield from the motherboard and manually bending the tabs. Then, I mounted the I/O shield again, and the holes aligned without issues. Before screwing it in, check that all the holes are in the right position. These are the screws you need to screw the motherboard on. They will come with your PC case. If you're not sure, you can always check the manual of your case to see which screws you have to use. Screw them in straight to prevent cross-threading. Tighten them until you start to meet resistance. Try to apply even force to all of them. If you dropped any screws, find them and remove them from the case, otherwise they could short out a component. Lastly, remove the protective film from our SSD heatsink. And screw it back in. During this step, I was unlucky enough to face another problem. When screwing the motherboard in, one of the screws at the top of the corner didn't seem to fit correctly. So, I removed the motherboard to inspect the standoff. To my surprise, the standoff was flat inside. This is very strange and most likely will not happen to you. I solved this by replacing the faulty standoff with one of the same length I had lying around, as Lian did not include any extra standoffs with their case. Now, flip the case up. With the motherboard fixed in place, we're going to install our 7200 RPM 3TB Toshiba hard drives. Locate the hard drive cage. Usually, you'll find it in the bottom part of the case. Pull out one of the hard drive trays from the cage, slightly pushing on the plastic tab. Get the hard drive inside the tray. Line up the holes on the tray with those on the hard drive, and screw it on with the screws that came with our case. We can check the case manual to ensure we're using the right screws. There are a lot of hard drive mounting mechanisms out there, so yours may vary a bit. Make sure to always install it with the connectors facing the back of the case, so we can connect the cables without any issues later on. If you're using a 2.5-inch SSD, the tray we saw earlier also has 4 holes to mount it. Your case will probably have some SSD bays too. On this case, we could install 2 SSDs here. 2 on these bays, or 2 on top of these power supply shroud covers. Make sure your motherboard supports all of your storage devices. Keep in mind that some motherboards disable a certain number of SATA ports when a second M.2 is installed. If you can't get the motherboard to recognize all of your SATA devices, this may be the issue. Next, we're going to connect our front panel connectors and fans. Check the motherboard manual to see where the connectors we have to use are located. They will be labeled on the motherboard itself too. When routing the cables, keep in mind that you'll need to do cable management later on. So planning what cable goes where and making sure there's nothing in the way will save you time down the road. We'll start with the trickiest part, the front panel switches and lights. These tiny cables plug into this connector located on the right side of our motherboard and labeled JFP1. As you can see, we have 4 cables, one for the reset switch, one for the power switch, and 2 cables for the LED power. The LED connector has a positive and negative cable. Same goes for the reset and power cables. The positive wire will be indicated with a small triangle. So this is the positive, and this is the negative. We have to remember this when connecting them. Route the cables from the closest hole to the JFP1 header, and check the manual to see where to connect them. Here, I connect the LED power, then the power switch, and the reset switch. Now, let's go with the front audio cable. The connector is located at the bottom left part of the motherboard. It's labeled JAUD1. I'll route it from this hole down here. As you can see, here we have a blank pin, so we just have to line it up and connect it. Next, the USB 3 cable for our front panel USB ports. On this motherboard, we have 2 USB 3 headers. I'm going to use the top one. Just match the blank pin on the edge of the connector and plug it in. Be careful to not tighten the cables too much, as you could rip off this connector easily. In this case, we have a fan controller that controls the fan speed and acts as a fan hub. I'm connecting it to the fan header, labeled System Fan 5. However, we have another 4 fan connectors on this motherboard, in case you want to use them. With the fan hub plugged in, we'll attach the fan bracket back onto the case. Route the fan cables. Secure it with the screws we've removed earlier. And lastly, connect the 2 front fans to the fan hub. Now we're connecting our hard drives using the SATA cables that came with our motherboard. As you can see, the plug is identical on both sides. Even so, I recommend plugging the flat one into the motherboard to save space. Use the small port on our hard drive to connect the SATA cable. Carefully push it in until the metal part on our connector clips in place. Like this. In order for our hard drives to function properly, we have to avoid bending these cables at more than a 90-degree angle. Let's connect the other side of these cables to the motherboard. Here we have 4 SATA ports. We're going to use 1 and 2. Plug it in, aligning this L-shaped connector with the port on our motherboard. As with the hard drive, push it in slightly until the metal part clicks in place. Now that most of the electrostatic sensitive components are installed, we can take off the anti-static bracelet and disconnect ourselves from the power supply in order to install it into the case. We went with the Corsair RM750 fully modular power supply. For this build, 750 watts is more than enough to run our system with no issues. Besides, Corsair is a pretty reliable brand. Before moving on, note that there are 3 power supply types. Regular, that has all the cables attached. Semi-modular, that has only the important ones attached, like the cable for the CPU and our motherboard. And the fully modular power supply, where all the cables come separately and you only connect the cables that you're using at the moment. I like to start by connecting all the cables we're going to need to the power supply before mounting it into the case, as there is going to be very little space to work with once the power supply is installed. First, the 2 8-pin CPU power cables. We can plug them in any of these connectors labeled CPU. I'm plugging them into these 2. Depending on your CPU, you may need to plug in just one of these cables. Second, the 24-pin ATX cable to power our motherboard. It plugs into the largest connector, labeled 24-pin ATX, as well as the smaller one. Third, the PCIe cable to power our graphics card. And lastly, the cable to power our hard drives and the front panel lights. As the PCIe and the CPU power connectors are the same on the side that plugs into the power supply, we can plug it in any of these connectors. Note that depending on your build, you may need to use additional cables to power your parts. The layout of all the cables and connectors is the same, and usually they're labeled, so don't worry, there's no way to screw it up. Now let's put it inside the case. In some PC cases, we have to push the cables and the power supply through this cutout and then screw it in. Here, we need to slide it in from the side. And match the holes on the power supply with the holes on the case. Make sure the fan on the bottom of the power supply is facing the intake at the bottom of the case. Never install a power supply with its fan facing towards a solid panel. Without proper cooling, it will burn out quickly. Secure the power supply with the screws that came with it. Your case may include some screws for the power supply too. On this case, we can also move the drive cage forward a little to make more room for the cables. Let's see where all the cables need to go. As I mentioned earlier, route them from the closest hole to the connector. I'll go with the 24-pin connector first. This is the largest of them, so it'll be easy to locate. Plug it in until the plastic tab clicks in place. Now the CPU power connectors. They're located at the top left part of the motherboard. Match the connectors and make sure the plastic tabs clip in place. The locations of the CPU power and the 24-pin connector will generally be around this area on most conventional motherboards. Let's route the PCIe cable for later, when we install the graphics card. Now let's connect our SATA devices. As you can see, this cable can power 3 SATA devices. We have to connect the front panel SATA. Just match the connectors and plug it in. The remaining SATA connectors plug into our hard drives, like this. Now, probably the most exciting part for all of us, the graphics card. This is a Gigabyte RTX 3070 Gaming OC 8GB graphics card. And trust me, it was really hard to get. To install it, I recommend to put your case in a horizontal position. Remove this plastic film. We have to install the card into the PCIe slot closest to the CPU. Remove the PCIe slot cover parallel to the slot we're going to use. We'll have to remove the next cover too, as most modern graphics cards occupy 2 of these, but that depends on the thickness of your card. Lower this notch on the end of the slot. Take the card from the anti-static bag and remove the cover from the connector. Lower the card straight into the PCIe slot until the plastic tab clips back in place. Now secure it with the screws we removed earlier. I didn't see that the fans had some plastic film on them. Make sure you remove the film before installing it if your card has any. Connect the power cable we routed previously to the GPU. This graphics card requires one 8-pin connector and one 6-pin connector. Make sure the clip snaps in place. With the graphics card installed, we can flip the case back into a vertical position and get to the cable management. Plan where you want the cables to go, and then fix them in place with the zip ties. Make sure the back panels fit before tying them. Try not to bend the cables too much, especially the ones going to our hard drives. Also be careful not to cut any cables when cutting the zip ties. You can fix the cables in place on the front too. And for the most part, that's all. We're done with the cable management. Now I'm going to install these metal covers back onto our case. Screw them in with the screws we've removed earlier. Same goes for the panels that cover up our cables on the back. Install the front panel too by slightly pushing on the edges. and put the dust filter back on. Let's try to power on the computer to see if everything works fine. Plug a mouse and the keyboard into the computer. Plug the display into the graphics card, and the power cord into the power supply. Make sure to flip the switch on the power supply to the on position. And lastly, push the power button on your case to power on the computer. Mash the delete button to get into BIOS. Once in BIOS, check that everything is detected and running fine. We can see our CPU, the memory, our storage devices. Everything seems fine to me. During this step of the build, I faced another issue. When setting the speed of the fans to automatic on the front panel switch, the fans just went to 100% speed no matter what. After some research, I found out that you need to connect one of the fans to this white port of the hub in order for it to function properly. With this solved, we can power off the computer and reinstall the side panels. There's an L for left and R for right marked on them, so you know what panel goes where. To install them, just lower them into the hinges. You don't need to use any screws as these panels are held closed by magnets. Next, one of my favorite parts of the build. We can enjoy the peel of the plastic film from the side panels. Now we have to install Windows and the necessary drivers for our system to work properly. You'll need another computer and an empty USB flash drive for this. Connect the USB drive to the second computer. Search Windows Bootable USB online and go to the Microsoft site. Scroll down and download the media creation tool. Open it, accept the terms, choose Create Media Installation for another PC. Choose your language, and click Next. Select USB flash drive, and then click Next. Now select the flash drive you wish to install Windows onto, and wait till the tool finishes creating the installation media. This took me about 20 minutes. When over, click Finish, and that's it. Now connect the USB drive we created to the PC and turn it on. It will automatically start the Windows installation process. Select your preferred settings here and click Next. Then click Install. Now we'll need a Windows key. Here you have two options. You can get the retail version at the Microsoft Store for the full price, or get an OEM version for cheaper. The main difference is that the OEM version gets linked to your PC components when activated. So for example, if you swap your motherboard, you'll have to buy another copy of Windows. This is the version of Windows that laptops and pre-built computers usually come with. I'll go with the second option here. Enter your Windows key. Click on Custom Install, and select the drive you want to install Windows onto. Make sure you always install it on your fastest storage device. I'm choosing our Sabrent M.2 SSD. Click Next and wait until the installation is complete. Note that your PC may restart a few times during this process. It usually takes about 20 minutes depending on your storage device speed. Now it'll take you to this step. Just fill out all the information until you get to the desktop. With Windows installed, we need to partition our hard drives so we can use them. Search for disk and select Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions. The disk management window will pop up, and as you can see, these two storage devices have a black bar. This means that the space is unallocated. Right-click on the drive you want to allocate. Click Next. Next. Click Next again. Here you can name it as you wish. I'm going to name mine hard drive 1 and click next. That's it. Now our hard drive is ready to use and it will show up in the File Explorer. Do the same for the rest of your storage devices. Search for power options and set the power plan to high performance. This will slightly boost the performance of our system. Now let's download all the drivers we need. Search your motherboard model online and download the drivers from the manufacturer's website. We also need the drivers for our graphics card. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, go to the NVIDIA website and download the GeForce Experience. If you have an AMD graphics card, download this tool from their website that will automatically detect your GPU and install the correct drivers. Now let's install all the drivers we downloaded from our motherboard manufacturer. Go to the drivers folder and look for the setup file. Launch it and follow the installation process for each driver. Your PC may restart a couple of times during this process. When you're done installing the drivers, restart your PC and mash the delete key until you get into BIOS. You'll need to get into the advanced options by pressing F7. Now that we're in advanced mode, we can change the speed of our memory. Go into the overclocking settings, and here in DRAM settings, enable the AXMP profile. Save the settings and restart the computer. As you can see, now it's running at 3200 MHz. And that's it. Our PC is finished. We're done building the computer and now it's time to enjoy it. I'll leave a link to all the parts that I used in the description below in case you want to check them out. Tell me in the comments if the video was helpful and how it went for you. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.